The American consumer has officially hit the wall. For 3 years, the mainstream media has been asking the same question. How are they still spending? How, with inflation up 20%, wages stagnant, and housing unaffordable, are the malls still full and the restaurants still packed? Yesterday, we got the answer, and it is terrifying. They weren't spending income. They were spending survival. A new report from the Federal Reserve has just confirmed that for the first time in history, the cost of servicing household debt has exceeded the amount of money being saved. The lines have crossed. The delinquency crossover has arrived. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why this specific data point is the trigger for the greatest spending collapse since 1929. You will see why the strong consumer narrative was the greatest lie of the decade, designed to keep you buying until the exact moment the credit limit was reached. And you will understand that what is coming next is not a soft landing. It is a consumption cliff. When 70% of an economy is based on buying things and the buyers run out of money all at once, the system doesn't slow down. It stops. This is not a prediction. This is a pattern. It is the exact same sequence of events that played out in the Roaring '20s before the crash and in the housing bubble of 2008. We are watching the stage 3 of the economic cycle, the exhaustion phase. Let me explain the math because the numbers are screaming. Stage 1 was the stimulus sugar high. That was 2021. The government mailed out checks. People felt rich. They bought Pelotons and day traded crypto. Stage 2 was the inflationary maintenance. That was 2022 and 2023. Prices went up, but people refused to lower their standard of living. They depleted their savings to keep buying the same groceries and the same vacations. Stage 3, where we are right now, is the debt delusion. The savings hit zero. So to maintain the illusion of the middle-class life, the American consumer turned to the credit card. But not just the credit card. They turned to the shadow debt. We are seeing a massive explosion in buy now, pay later BNPL services. Affirm, Klarna, Afterpay. These aren't being used for luxury handbags anymore. They are being used for groceries. They are being used for gas. When you have to finance a sandwich over 4 weeks, you are not resilient. You are insolvent. The data released yesterday shows that credit card delinquency rates have just breached the 2008 highs for younger borrowers. Gen Z and millennials are defaulting on their auto loans at a rate we haven't seen since the great financial crisis. This is the trigger. The banks see this data before you do. And what do banks do when they see defaults spike? They cut the credit lines. That is the collapse. It isn't that people decide to stop spending. It is that the machine declines the card. Imagine an economy where 30% of all spending is fueled by revolving debt. Now imagine that fuel line is cut overnight. You are looking at a 10% to 15% contraction in GDP in a single quarter. That is not a recession. That is a depression. The spending collapse is the moment the Wile E. Coyote looks down. The consumer has run off the cliff, powered by Visa and MasterCard, churning their legs in thin air. The delinquency crossover is the moment gravity takes over. In the next part, I am going to expose the shadow debt that the government isn't counting. I am going to show you the phantom liabilities hidden in the buy now, pay later sector that are about to blow up the retail market. And I will explain why the upcoming holiday season will be the black swan event that reveals the emptiness of the American wallet. The consumer didn't just slow down, they died. Let's look at the hidden numbers. The official debt numbers are terrifying enough, but the reason the spending collapse will be catastrophic, the reason it will happen overnight instead of over a year, is because of the debt that isn't on the books. We need to talk about the shadow ledger. The Federal Reserve tracks credit card debt, they track auto loans, they track mortgages, but they do not track the phantom debt that has exploded in the last 24 months. I am talking about the unregulated, unreported, and systemic risk of the buy now, pay later industry. In 2021, services like Affirm, Klarna, and Afterpay were niche tools for millennials buying Peloton bikes or designer sneakers. It was fun debt. Today, it is survival debt. According to a Harris poll conducted just last month, 43% of BNPL users are using these services to pay for utility bills. 21% are using them to buy groceries. Let that sink in. We have a significant portion of the American population financing a loaf of bread over 4 bi-weekly payments. This is what economists call phantom debt. Because these companies do not report to the major credit bureaus in real time, the Federal Reserve doesn't see it. The banks don't see it. When a consumer applies for a mortgage or a car loan, the bank looks at their credit report and sees a clean sheet. They don't see that the applicant owes $4,000 to 3 different BNPL apps for food and gas, so the bank lends them more money. We are stacking subprime credit on top of shadow credit. It is 2008 all over again, but this time, the collateral isn't a house that can be foreclosed on. The collateral is a sandwich that has already been eaten. You cannot repossess a utility bill. The recovery rate on this debt will be zero, and the scale of this shadow ledger is massive. Adobe Analytics reported that during the last holiday season, BNPL usage drove $16.6 billion in online spending. That is up 14% year over year. The media spun this as the consumer is resilient. They are still shopping. No, the consumer is desperate. They are using the last lifeline available to them because their credit cards are maxed out. When you see spending go up while savings go down and phantom debt explodes, you are looking at a liquidation event disguised as a boom. This mirrors the installment plan crisis of 1929. In the 1920s, Americans started buying radios, cars, and furniture on time. It was a new invention. It made everyone feel rich. They spent money they didn't have to buy things they couldn't afford. The economy roared, until the monthly payments overwhelmed the monthly wages. In 1929, the consumer stopped buying. Factory orders collapsed. Unemployment spiked. The Great Depression began not on Wall Street but on Main Street when the installment payments stopped coming. We are at that exact precipice again. But the speed of this collapse will be faster. In 1929, it took months for the data to circulate. Today, the algorithms will cut off access to credit in milliseconds. The delinquency crossover we discussed in Part 1 is the signal that the monthly payments have finally overwhelmed the monthly wages. The shadow debt is the hidden leverage that ensures the fall will be fatal. And this brings us to the retail apocalypse. The companies relying on this phantom spending are walking zombies. Target, Walmart, Macy's, they are forecasting earnings based on sales fueled by debt that will never be repaid. When the BNPL defaults hit and delinquency rates in that sector are already double the credit card rates, the consumer stops showing up. We are staring down the barrel of a holiday black swan. The upcoming spending season will be the final binge. Americans will use the last of their phantom credit to buy Christmas, and in January, the bills will arrive. That is when the spending collapse becomes visible. That is when the retail earnings crash. That is when the layoffs begin. The strong consumer is a myth. It is a corpse propped up by high-interest loans and shadow accounting. The government tells you unemployment is low. They tell you GDP is up, but they are looking at the rearview mirror. They are looking at the spending, not the source of the funds for that spending. When you finance your survival, you are not living. You are slowly dying. And the American consumer has just entered the terminal phase. In the next part, I am going to show you the corporate contagion. We will look at how this consumer collapse flows upstream to the banks and the manufacturers. We will look at the inventory gluts that are building up right now in warehouses across the country, goods that nobody can afford to buy. And I will explain why the repo market, the plumbing of the financial system, is starting to seize up again, just like it did in 2019 and 2008. The consumer is the first domino. The banking system is the second. Let's look at the supply chain of disaster. The consumer has stopped spending. The shadow debt is imploding. But the terrifying part of this collapse isn't what happens at the cash register. It is what happens at the loading dock. We need to talk about the bullwhip effect. This is an economic law that states when the consumer at the end of the chain sneezes, the manufacturer at the start of the chain catches pneumonia. And right now, the American manufacturing and logistics sector is about to go into cardiac arrest. You see, for the last 2 years, retailers like Target, Walmart, and Amazon made a fatal miscalculation. They looked at the stimulus sugar high of 2021 and assumed it was the new normal. They assumed you would keep buying flat-screen TVs and patio furniture forever, so they ordered massive amounts of inventory. They filled the warehouses to the brim. But then, the delinquency crossover hit. You stopped buying. Now those retailers are sitting on what we call an inventory glut. They are holding billions of dollars of depreciating assets that nobody wants. And here's the problem. It costs money to hold that stuff. You have to pay rent on the warehouse, you have to pay insurance, you have to pay the staff to guard it. Inventory that doesn't move is cancer to a business. It eats cash flow alive. And this triggers the corporate contagion. Right now, major U.S. retailers are panicked. They are slashing prices, which sounds good for inflation, but it destroys their profit margins. But more importantly, they are canceling orders. They are calling the factories in Ohio, in Vietnam, in China, and saying, stop. We are seeing the sharpest contraction in new orders for manufacturing since the COVID lockdowns. But this time, it isn't because the government closed the factories. It is because there is no demand. This flows upstream to the trucking companies. We are currently in a freight recession. Trucking companies are going bankrupt at the fastest pace in decades because there is nothing to move. Yellow trucking was just the beginning. The entire logistics web is starving. But the real contagion, the one that threatens your bank account, is in the financial plumbing. You need to understand how this inventory is paid for. Walmart doesn't pay cash for everything. Smaller retailers certainly don't. They use revolving credit lines secured by the inventory itself. The bank lends them money to buy the jeans, and the jeans are the collateral. What happens when the collateral is worthless? What happens when a bank realizes that the warehouse full of unsold electronics is worth 40% less than the loan they issued against it? The bank issues a margin call. They demand cash. But the retailer has no cash because the consumer has no money, so the retailer defaults. This is exactly how the 2008 crisis spread from housing to the rest of the economy. But instead of toxic mortgages, today we have toxic inventory and toxic consumer debt. And this brings us to the most dangerous signal in the global financial system, the repo market. The repo market is the pawn shop for banks. It is where banks lend cash to each other overnight to stay solvent. It is the grease that keeps the engine running. When the repo market works, you don't hear about it. When it seizes up, the system dies. Right now, we are seeing stress fractures in the repo market, similar to September 2019, right before the Fed had to intervene with emergency printing. Banks are hoarding cash. They are refusing to lend to each other. Why? Because they don't trust the collateral. Bank A won't lend to Bank B because Bank B is holding a massive bag of bad car loans and defaulted retail credit lines. The trust has evaporated. When the repo market freezes, the ATMs stop working. The credit cards get declined not because you are broke, but because the bank is broke. The spending collapse that began with the American consumer maxing out their credit card has now mutated into a liquidity crisis for the banking sector. The inventory glut is the physical manifestation of the problem. The repo spike is the financial manifestation. We are watching the just-in-time delivery system crash into the just-ran-out-of-money consumer. And the government knows it. That is why the Federal Reserve is panicking behind the scenes. They know that if they don't print money soon, the deflationary wave from this inventory collapse will wipe out the zombie companies that make up 20% of the S&P 500. But if they do print money to save the banks, they reignite the inflation that killed the consumer in the first place. They are trapped. The consumer is tapped out. The warehouses are full. The banks are scared. This is the end of the road for the debt-based expansion. In the final part of this video, I'm going to explain the end game. I'm going to show you what happens when the spending strike becomes permanent. We will look at the inevitable pivot to universal basic income, UBI disguised as stimulus, and why that will be the final nail in the coffin for the dollar's purchasing power. And most importantly, I will tell you what assets you need to own when the deflation of stuff turns into the hyperinflation of money. The collapse has triggered. Now we prepare for the impact. Let's look at the solution. The collapse has triggered. The consumer has stopped spending. The warehouses are full of unsold goods. The banks are rejecting the collateral. Now we look at the end game. We look at how the government responds when the engine of the U.S. economy, consumption, seizes up completely. You need to understand one fundamental rule of the modern fiat system. The system cannot survive deflation. Deflation, falling prices, and falling wages is the nightmare scenario for the state. Why? Because the U.S. government owes $35 trillion. You cannot pay back $35 trillion with dollars that are becoming more valuable. You cannot service that debt if tax revenues collapse because nobody is buying anything. So when the spending strike becomes permanent in early 2026, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury will have only one card left to play. They will panic. They will look at the crashing retail sector, the bankrupt trucking companies, and the defaulting credit card borrowers, and they will declare a national economic emergency. And this is where the pivot happens. This is where we move from inflation to hyperstagflation. They will introduce Stimulus 2.0, but they won't call it stimulus. They will call it cost of living relief. They will call it the Middle Class Support Act. It will be the precursor to universal basic income, to a UBI. They will send digital checks directly to the people to restart the spending machine. They will bypass the banks and inject liquidity straight into your pocket, likely through a central bank digital currency pilot program. This is the trap. Because while this printed money will allow people to buy food and gas again, it will destroy the purchasing power of the dollar instantly. We are heading for a bifurcated economy. This is a phenomenon we haven't seen since the 1970s, but on a much larger scale. On one side, you will have the deflation of stuff. The prices of discretionary goods, flat-screen TVs, designer clothes, furniture, used cars will crash. Nobody wants them, and the inventory glut is massive. You will see 70% off signs everywhere. On the other side, you will have the hyperinflation of needs. The things you must have to survive, meat, energy, insurance, rent, will skyrocket. Why? Because the printed money will chase the scarce resources. You will be able to buy a 65-inch TV for $200, but a steak will cost $50. You will be able to buy a used BMW for pennies on the dollar, but the insurance to drive it will be $400 a month. This is the standard of living collapse. You will own more toys, but your quality of life will plummet. So how do you position yourself? What do you own when the dollar is dying, but the stores are full of cheap junk? You do not buy the junk. You do not buy the consumer discretionary stocks. Target, Amazon, Ford. Those companies are dead money for the next decade. You buy the basis of the pyramid. Energy. The grid must stay on. The trucks, what few are running, need diesel. Oil and natural gas stocks are the ultimate hedge against the UBI inflation. Hard money, gold and silver. When the government starts sending out relief checks, the smart money knows the currency is broken. They will flee to the only assets that have no counterparty risk. Gold is your savings account. Silver is your speculative upside. Debt erasure. If you have variable rate debt, kill it. Now. When the UBI comes, inflation will spike, and interest rates will likely stay high or go higher to fight it. Do not be a debtor in a high-rate environment. The spending collapse is not the end of the world. It is the end of an era. It is the end of the consumer age where prosperity was measured by how much plastic junk you could buy on credit. We are entering the scarcity age. In this new era, wealth is not defined by your credit limit. It is defined by what you own, what you control, and how independent you are from the system. The American consumer has finally hit the wall. The delinquency crossover was the signal. The crash is the consequence. But for you, the person watching this video, it is the opportunity. While the masses are waiting for their relief check, you are building a fortress of real assets. While they are panic buying bread, you are positioned in the commodities that produce the bread. The pattern is complete. Stage 1, stimulus. Stage 2, inflation. Stage 3, exhaustion. Now comes stage 4, the reset. I am economy meet history. The history books are clear. When the consumer dies, the currency follows. Make sure you are holding the assets that survive the funeral. Subscribe now. The next few months will move fast. You need to be ready. I'll see you in the next video.